So I'm sitting in the BREEAM team. I'm responsible for not only Home Quality Mark but also BREEAM Communities, which is our master planning certification scheme as well. So some of the things that we're talking in this morning about building a community also fits within that side of things as well. So I was asked to talk about what do people want from their homes, and we've been doing a number of pieces of consumer research, which is not necessarily the normal thing that BRE does, and actually talking to members of the public and understanding what they want from their home. So that's what I've been asked to talk about. So what I've done is kind of split it up into 4 main areas. So obviously the first one, something that's within our means, something that we can afford to live in. We've obviously talked about healthy homes, something that makes you feel good. Something for the future. How is it going to impact our world going forwards? And then finally, we've talked about some of the problems in the house building sector in terms of trust, and we've talked about the APPG report in terms of some of the views of the general public about house building. So I'm going to go into that at the end there. But first, that question, what do people want from their home? So I thought, well, might as well ask my wife. She's a person, she's sitting next to me at home when I was thinking about this. Probably a bit dangerous. She's also a scientist as well, so I could kind of tick that box of doing something by science. Unfortunately, she's a marine biologist, so she said a house with swimming pools, close to somewhere I can go diving, somewhere where friends can come over, probably with at least 30 degrees heat outside somewhere. A bit like your mate's house, Jamie in Bali. I was like, yeah, great. So that's what my wife's ideal house is at the moment. Yeah, it is actually a friend of ours' house who's been a banker in Hong Kong for the last 15 years with his wife. So they can afford that. That's not within our means. We've worked for government and in the environmental sector and for charities and bummed around the world quite a lot. So it's not within our means, unfortunately. So yeah, that first thing of having something that we can afford doesn't always necessarily quite fit what we'd really want. The next one then turned into a Muse in Camden, which was equally unaffordable at the moment. So where do we spend our money at the moment? What do people spend our money? Housing is always the thing that comes up. This is ONS data. It's from 2014, so it's a little bit out of date, but it's still broadly, the broad picture of where people spend their money. This is an average across the whole of the UK, so there's obviously some people in different parts of the UK who are spending slightly differently. But some things that jump out, we spend more on alcohol and tobacco than we do education and health. So this is our personal spending, not including tax. So obviously taxes would make those much bigger. But yes, we do spend more on alcohol and tobacco. Maybe that's a community, the well-being side of things that people think. Housing, fuel and power, so that's not just mortgages, that's also the running costs to heat and run your home. It's actually very similar to transport, and they're very much interlinked in terms of location, about where you want to be. Some other areas which we spend quite a lot of money, recreation, must be linked to alcohol and tobacco, hopefully, unless you're drinking and smoking at home. And then food is obviously another big area. Some of these areas in terms of health, a lot of that is obviously bolstered by taxation. Sorry that some of the wording's come slightly off the slide. So what can our home, how our communities are created, how our homes are built, how can that impact all these other areas of spending? I just kind of had a bit of a think, and actually there's probably quite a few different areas that actually we can influence. So obviously there's the heating, fuel and power, and potentially rent and mortgages that we can influence. We can certainly influence transport. If our homes are located in an area where there's work and there's schools and that kind of thing, then actually our transport bills can be a lot lower. If our work is located in areas where maybe there isn't so much public transport, I think we might be at one right now, that transport can be quite expensive. I do try and cycle here from central London, which is easier said than done some days. So that can be very influential about where you live. Obviously I know some developers are beginning to start to have community areas where you can grow food. So actually maybe we might be able to start to influence that cost and potentially reduce the amount of waste that we have on food. And obviously that's an area that the WELL standard looks at. We're never going to get to 100% of the food in terms of our community and our home, but it's something that we can influence. Other areas includes household goods and services, so that includes a lot of maintenance and that side of things as well. So obviously if we can have reduced maintenance, or there's obviously a lot of scenarios where people are now beginning to introduce a lot of that service charge within the overall cost, and those two start to join up. So yeah, there's lots of different areas of our expenditure which we can influence by what our houses are. But it's not just your personal finance, it's actually how we invest and how we actually build developments as well that we need to think about in terms of the whole financial sector. That was a photograph that was taken, I think it was in the summer or the summer before, in terms of a queue outside a new development in London. We still do have a housing crisis. I think the common thread this morning was talking about consumers or householders or people, and people do want to have a shelter, and actually some of the major house builders are able to build homes, and it doesn't really matter whether they're of high quality or of good sustainability. They sell because people need a shelter, and that fundamental supply aspect is really key. I'm going to mention Sustainable Homes, and they've recently done a interesting piece of research looking at social housing providers and seeing the link between higher performing homes, more sustainable homes, more quality homes, and the impact upon rent arrears and voids. So I think they had about 3,000 or 4,000 data points on this, which was quite a large amount, and over hundreds of different RSLs, that actually where people were building higher quality homes, they were getting fewer rent arrears, so people were paying their rent on time because they weren't suddenly getting high energy bills, and they were also getting fewer voids. So voids are obviously periods of time when a rental property doesn't have somebody living there. We were actually at Grosvenor earlier this week, and they seem to have rental voids issues, although they seem to suggest it was for slightly different reasons than it is from social housing. So maybe actually a kind of thing works for them as well. Other side of things in terms of outside of the personal finance sector is the investment side of things. There's some really interesting things going on in the city at the moment. Lloyds have offered £1 billion in cut rate loans for green buildings. So it's not just housing, it's also more widely in terms of commercial buildings. And they're currently using BREEAM and HQM as a way of measuring that indicator to show that the buildings are green. If we can start to influence the financial sector even more, that can help to drive up the standards as well. So we don't always need to look to government. There's also other players in the sector which we can influence. And HSBC are also along similar lines, that actually they see it much more of a binary decision, that potentially on smaller developers, that actually if you're using higher standards, you understand the community and you're striving for better goals, then actually that makes them as an investment decision much more binary, and it may mean more yeses, hopefully. So the next area that I want to talk about is what do people want from their homes is their health and well-being. So Joe talked about the UK GBC work, and I'm not going to repeat that. I contemplated using that slide, but I think it's been used too many times already. We've done our own little bits of research. We worked with Grand Designs and did a number of pieces of surveys and asking people what they want from their homes. And community was the most important factor for 67% of people. So that community aspect is really key in terms of people's health and well-being. It is effectively location, location, location. People want to be able to communicate with their neighbours. They want to feel like they're part of something. But then, not far behind that was something like good daylighting, which isn't something that's regulated. It is something that is in planning, but it is broadly something that's voluntary, and actually that's something that people want. People don't necessarily know how to measure it though, which is a bit of a problem. The general public don't necessarily know how to measure it. And perhaps there's some other drivers that are driving for health of communities. So BRE's done a report into the cost of poor housing to the NHS, which is currently around 1.4 billion, which is a huge amount. NHS is often comes at the top of people's political agenda of something that they want to protect. Well, maybe then, if we want to reduce costs to the NHS, we should look at housing. This is obviously not just to do with new housing, it's also to do with this existing housing. But those are huge amounts of potential savings that we could by improving the housing overall. It's quite interesting to see that actually 15,000 Londoners gave their views on the recent London air pollution, and we mentioned it earlier in terms of people beginning to look at it, look at locations in terms of air pollution and where they might live in the future. And actually there's a high proportion of people that want to limit air pollution in the city. And we mustn't just think it's always from transport. There are a huge number of buildings that are also adding to this. And the problem with buildings is that their lifespan hopefully is a lot longer than a car. A car will be off the roads in 5 years, whereas a building should be around for at least 50 years. And so actually that problem is a much longer problem with buildings than it is with the transport sector. So something for the future. Pew is a charitable organisation. They do global studies. And one of the questions I asked in 2015 is, what are people very concerned about? And people are actually more concerned about climate change than they are about the global economy. If you look at the news at any point in time, there's probably going to be more stories about the economy than there are about climate change, which seems to suggest that the news is not reflective of people's opinions, according to this survey, maybe. Interestingly, everyone's very concerned about ISIS. I would kind of maybe put a caveat around that when I speak to my cousin who's a farmer in North Wales, who's very concerned about ISIS. He's a farmer in North Wales. I'm not particularly sure how much of a threat ISIS is to him, but he does tend to read the Daily Mail and stuff, so I'm sure he's very concerned about that. But perhaps climate change might actually be more of an issue to him as a farmer. Just a thought. Yeah, that's family discussions for you. Yeah, so climate change does actually come quite high up on this, and perhaps more so than territorial disputes with China and the global economy, which is quite interesting, on the same level as Iran's nuclear threat, which, as this is 2015 and I think the data came from 2014, that's probably gone down somewhat now, and tensions with Russia, maybe that's actually gone up a little bit. As someone who studied international politics, I find this very interesting and can go into all sorts of conversations about it, which probably are slightly irrelevant to this. And so are consumers becoming more sustainable in what they're doing in terms of their action? Well, you know, drop in plastic bag use by 85%. Okay, that's because of a government-driven agenda. Electric car charging, overtaking fossil fuels by 2027. Well, I was just having a conversation with Bill that we need some more electric car charging points here. There's not enough. But then perhaps more on the voluntary side of things. Good Energy, which is a renewable energy company, their profits have gone up by something like 25% in the last year. The number of customers have gone up by 31%. And that's a huge amount of increase. And people are choosing to be more sustainable. They're not being forced to do that. There's no government intervention in that one whatsoever. The same with sustainable fish, actually. There's very little government intervention in that actually there's not enough supply of sustainable fish. It's probably because actually a lot of fish is not sustainable. But these ones over here obviously have a government intervention. I'd just like to point out here, obviously Wales is doing much better than the rest of the UK in terms of recycling, looking after the land and all that. And then it's beginning to see some signs of it in housing as well. So Redrow have recently done a survey. They're seeing that actually people want to buy homes from house builders that are perceived to be sustainable. And Go Compare did some work with Mail Online about what's the most important things in terms of people choosing their home, and energy efficiency is coming very high up the agenda there. So people are making choices to be more sustainable. So when house builders say to me, oh, people are not interested in it, I actually disagree. I think there is actually beginnings to be some real change, and that moral imperative that Pete was talking about earlier is there, and people want to do something about it. They just don't necessarily know how. So my final area is a shelter that you can trust. So as part of our survey with Grand Designs, we asked people how much do they trust house builders. 10% placed a high level of trust with house builders, which is quite a, obviously it's at Grand Design, so you've got a certain amount of type of people there, and only 1/3 of those respondents were neutral on this. There's a real perception issue about house builders in this country. We're going to the next one. This is an HBF survey, so it's not one of ours. 46% of respondents said they were unlikely to buy a new home. So there's 54% of the country who are, no, so there's 46% of the country who would not think about buying a new home. That's a real problem in terms of acceptance of new homes. It impacts on all sorts of different ways. So it obviously means that people aren't looking at new homes because they don't think that's for them. They think it's for somebody else. It means that it makes it more difficult for planning because there's that perception issue, because they don't think new homes are of quality. And it also impacts skills as well, because if house building has a good reputation, if there's a good perception and people want to live in a new home, then actually people are more likely to work in the sector as well. So this figure, I think, is probably one of the most concerning figures, and actually throughout today we've been talking about how we engage with consumers, with the general population. That's a figure that I think we need to change. We've mentioned the all-parliamentary group earlier. Obviously lots of challenges in there, and if you ever look at this blog, you'll see some of the real problems that people have had with their homes, which is quite scary. I think that's the background that we need to be aware of. How do we build consumer trust? I don't think it's a particularly easy thing. So labels are perhaps one part of the story. We ask people, do they trust labels such as Fair Trade, MSC, FSC and Euro NCAP? Those are all independent third-party voluntary labels. 80% of people said that they do, partly or highly trust those independent certification. We started asking people around some of those facts in terms of housing, and actually people would prefer a home with an independent mark of quality and sustainability, whereas 75% would actually pay more for that home with that certificate. You know, if you go out and buy fish, which an MSA certified fish, it's going to cost more, and that's because it is being checked, it's being DNA checked and all sorts of things now to see that it is actually something that is sustainable. So it all can go wrong if we start making claims around sustainability, if we start making claims around health and well-being. Jo mentioned it in her talk that actually we kind of know from a design point of view how to do these things, but it often gets lost in the process through planning, through construction, through actually when it comes to sales and maintenance and the longer term picture. And so then we have this issue of greenwash. VW is obviously the current example of that. Last month their sales suffered a 25% drop in the UK. So it obviously impacts industry and it impacts your business model if you don't get things right on this side of things. There's some other examples there of Coke Life in the US that's been continuously criticised of something that's trying to make out that it's all green and happy and stuff, but it's not. It still has quite significant amounts of sugar in it. Huggies had their pure and natural brand of nappies. I've got an 8-month-old, so I can't not talk about nappies at the moment. And they were claiming to be cotton, but they were still going to landfill and causing a huge amount of waste and things. And now in the housing sector, we've had a developer that's been fined over false passive house claims, that they were saying that their homes were certified against passive house, but they weren't. Problem with that claim was that unfortunately the fine was not big enough in my opinion, and because the fine was smaller than the amount that it was going to cost to get up to the standard. But it is beginning to happen, and consumers are beginning to realise that there is a better way of doing things, And if house builders don't get it right, then people will come back to them, which will potentially cost their reputation. So is home quality marked the answer? Well, obvious answer to that is yes, but it's part of the picture. I'll be a little bit more candid than that. So I'm not going to talk about too much about what the home quality mark's doing, but overall star rating, impact around running costs, impact of health and well-being, and the environmental footprint. Currently, we've got around about 8,000 homes registered to the home quality mark, so we're beginning to start to jog along, I would say, and we've recently won the Home Apple Award. If you want to learn more about the home quality mark, you can ask me at any other point. Thank you.